nominally also slightly growing. So there are some elements of modernization when you include also so-called Connecting Europe Fund. Europe is badly connected, still badly connected, and especially as it comes to the long-term infrastructure investment in transportations, you cannot have, under the today circumstances, you cannot have too much of risk-taking. So we would like to upgrade the rating and to reduce the risk via involvement of European budget via so-called project-oriented bonds. And this is part of the modernization of the budget, never to such an extent exploited in the past. We have some conditionalities for better spending. We have some thresholds for greening of expenditure. So, and a new element of youth unemployment scheme of 6 billion euro. So there are still, despite the cuts, probably necessary to find unanimous position of 27 member states. We have still clear elements of modernization and some hope in the budget. But now what comes is of course, there are also some crisis responses. You know that we have upgraded the financing via budget and reducing co-financing via the national states for the countries with in clear economic troubles. So this is also about some crisis response feasible via the conclusions between the governments. But now comes the era of European Parliament. I see here key players. Alain Lamassoure is the chair of the Budgets Committee. Michael Theurer, renamed here Michael, is the chair of the Budgets Control Committee, and they are to be key players in this next round. I think Parliament cannot be happy with the outcome of the intergovernmental negotiations. And what should be the major room for improvement, absolutely necessary to have a budget implemented in the future, is the area of flexibility. That is, with low level of expenditure, we cannot lose money. It should be moved from heading to heading, which we should have flexibility from one year to another, as this is in the logic of multi-annual programs in the European Union, not to spend much at the beginning, that is 2014, 2015, but with accelerated pace of expenditure and programming at the final years of the financial framework. That is in the logic of multi-annual programs. They are accelerating at the end. And this is so here is the story of how to make this low volume budget implemented and manageable in the future, although I believe that whoever will be the Budgets Commissioner after 2014, it's not going to be fun. It is going to be difficult. But without flexibility, I cannot say this is manageable. We cannot lose money. It has to be shifted. It has to be spent given the low volumes agreed at the level of this unanimous decision by the states. This is also about simplification we promised to the people. We have a new financial regulation, and this is very much about simplification for grant, especially for the grant beneficiaries. It cannot be killed at the level of sectoral regulations. There is a propensity to over-regulate, to complicate what should be simplified. And here is a clear promise to beneficiaries around Europe. So I believe that what comes is a difficult round of negotiations with European Parliament, with clear task of improvement of what was decided between the governments. But the time is now also to activate the national parliaments as honest brokers between feeling what should be done for Europe now and the position of their own governments. So I see the time for action now, really, to activate also the national parliaments. I am to serve also as a sort of broker and intermediary, although I know what kind of budget I would like more for Europe 2014-2020. But I think we should deliver to the people that sort of predictability of investment, because this is about investment for several years, because this is clearly one of, not a perfect, not a silver bullet, not a perfect solution, but this is the partial solution to the shortage of investment money regionally and in the member states. So here is my message for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Lewandowski. If I can now call on Professor Carl Whelan to give us his presentation this morning. Professor Whelan.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for inviting me along today and for feeding me a nice dinner last night. So the first part of the headline of this session is supporting growth and reform, and I'll talk about growth and reform. But I'll start somewhere else. I'll start with another important word, which is debt. So if you ask senior policymakers around the world what they think their biggest problem is right now, I think a lot of them will tell you debt. They'll say, this is the theme that you see all around the world. Europe has a sovereign debt problem. Many countries in Europe have serious private debt problems. We look at the US, which has very high public debt to GDP ratio, and also quite serious private debt problems. Japan's very significant public debt. And it seems sometimes that the whole world is sort of drowning in debt. Let's take a step back for a minute and think about this. Who is it that the world owes all this debt to? I mean, one possibility is that we've opened up financial dealings with Mars and managed to get into debt to the Martians. But the truth is that the people of the world owe these debts to themselves. And one person's debts are another person's assets. Right? So in the same way as we can say there's too much debt, you might as well say there's too many assets. And viewed from that perspective, you know, there's a similar point to make when thinking about the solution to debt problems. So for many, it's just very simple. If a government's living beyond its means, then it needs to tighten its belt and it needs to spend less than it takes in income. If a household is living beyond its means, it needs to follow the example of the now infamous Swabian housewife and just learn to balance its books. And that's what we should do. And if you believe that, you can add a sort of moral stance to it as well. You know, this is morally the right thing to do. But that sort of simple prescription turns out to be more complicated when you examine it from a macroeconomic perspective. So in principles of macroeconomics, first year macro, one of the things we teach is that in a closed economy, income equals spending. And the world, as best we know, is a closed economy. But all around the world now, you see governments and private sectors that are focused on reducing spending. And the fear that many had when this process started a few years ago was that the primary effect of all the spending cuts would be to cut income. And that's pretty much how things have worked out. I mean, the global economy right now looks a lot like a dog that's expending enormous effort chasing its own tail and getting nowhere. Now, when you look at any individual economy that's not a closed economy, income doesn't equal spending. So you could have an economy that as a whole will spend less than it takes in income. And that turns out to be the same identity as saying that they're running a current account surplus. And that's one of the reasons that so many economists have focused on current accounts, which are not the obvious place that when you start thinking about debt necessarily. People look at public debt and private debt. But if you think that people are going to start spending less than their income, in the aggregate in the economy, you're saying that that economy should be running a current account surplus. Now, unfortunately, countries like Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and Greece all started the crisis with pretty sizable current account deficits and pretty significant accumulations of debt. And pretty quickly, financial markets decided that they didn't want to keep making loans to these countries, and now governments, businesses, and households in these countries are under severe pressure to run down these debt levels. And that means that both the governments, the households are all under pressure now to spend less than they take in income. Now, they have all improved their current account positions to some extent or another. Ireland is now in current account surplus. But generally, they're stuck in recession. And it's not clear to me that any of them are on a path that would see their debt reduced and the debt burdens go out of the danger zone, and I would include Ireland in that. And that's partly because adjusting to a current account deficit, to running a large current account surplus inside the euro is incredibly hard as the euro is constructed. And again, it's easy to say, well, they should just start running a current account surplus by spending less than they take in income. But in most economies, most spending is local spending. So, policies that focus simply on, well, we'll cut our current account by fiscal contraction. Most of the reduction in spending goes on local goods and services. In general, when you've seen in the past large turnarounds in current accounts, that's been because there's been something that has helped people switch expenditure, both in the domestic country and abroad, away from foreign goods and towards domestic goods. And that tool around the world tends to be the exchange rate. If you can depreciate, devalue your exchange rate, then you become more competitive, at least for some period of time. And that increases the demand for your goods. Of course, that can't be done within the Eurozone. So the Eurozone countries are going to have to become more competitive through cuts in costs, and labor is the predominant cost for most firms. But it's pretty hard in the Eurozone, again, to gain wage competitiveness, because against a background of inflation in the Eurozone going to be about a 2% average, you're only going to catch up in terms of wage competitiveness if you have, well, you're only going to catch up fast if you have outright wage cuts. And nominal wage cuts are generally difficult to implement, and that's not just a fact about rigid labor markets. If you look at labor markets like the US, there's plenty of evidence that firms themselves are very reluctant to cut nominal wages because of the effects that it has on morale. It's also worth noting that if you go this route and try to cut wages to get yourself back to competitiveness, you may help to get yourself back to a current account surplus, but debt burdens are best measured relative to income. And so for a lot of households, falling wages are going to make their mortgage debt burdens, their other types of debt, more unsustainable. So when we look at these countries, we see that public and private sectors are cutting spending. Cost competitiveness is improving, but it's improving very slowly. And the global economy is not doing well. So it's not so easy to export your way to expansion. So where does growth come from? Well, not long ago, we had a story from Europe's leaders about this, and it was that budget cuts themselves would provoke improved confidence from households, from firms, financial markets, and this would itself produce the demand to offset fiscal austerity. Now, experience has not been kind to this story, and I think instead the evidence tends to favor the traditional Keynesian assumption that fiscal contraction is contractionary. In recent years, I think the story has changed a little bit. I think there's less discussion of Professor Krugman's famous confidence theory. And the story is a little bit different now. I think the story now is that, okay, fiscal contraction has a negative effect, but growth is going to come from implementing positive supply-side reforms. Now, this at least I think is a story that you can engage with as an economist. And I don't have any doubt that there are plenty of Eurozone countries that are in difficulty now that could benefit over time from supply-side reforms in product markets and labor markets. We can all tell our own stories from our own countries about ways in which things don't work well. And there's no doubt those reforms can improve competitiveness and efficiency. But I have to say, until the last year or so, I never heard at any academic economics conference, I never heard professional macroeconomists discuss these policies as the ideal policies to offset austerity. I have some bad news on this front. This is an area I know quite a bit about. And in general, I would say that economists are pretty hopeless at figuring out both the size and the timing of the effects of supply-side reforms. We're just not, we're not good at that stuff. You know, so we may say deregulating labor markets has a positive effect. You try to tell us how positive it will be and what the timing will be and in what sense it will offset fiscal austerity. We don't know, so I'm not quite sure why everybody else is so confident. In fact, I actually think that you could argue that it's possible that in the short run that some of the reforms that are needed could actually make things worse. So one example is reducing firing costs. Right? So this is definitely something that, I mean, I've spoken with businessmen that have said, I don't want to employ people in Spain because once I take them on, it's very difficult to get rid of them, and I need to have more flexibility. So, okay, let's go and reduce firing costs in Spain. And in the long run, that'll benefit the demand for labor. In the short run, lots of people get fired. That makes things worse, not better. I think it's also the case that politically, those kinds of disruptive reforms are much more difficult to implement at times when governments are unpopular, and austerity governments are pretty much by definition unpopular. Comparisons are often made these days between the current period and the German labour market reforms of the last decade. And it's not uncommon to hear, and there's something to this, German politicians say, you know, we took our medicine in terms of our reforms and it wasn't very pleasant, and you should do the same thing now. Again, while I would favour labour market reforms, I think that particular view probably reads a bit too much into Germany's experience. I mean, these were reforms that were taken during a period when economic growth with Germany's trading partners was fairly strong. It was not a period in which they restored competitiveness by having large wage cuts. It was rather a period of slow wage growth. And that recipe is not going to work to restore Spain and other peripheral countries to prosperity anytime soon. And more generally, the confidence that people place in the positive effect of supply-side reforms should be balanced against the fact that, I mean, since I was in short pants, the EU has been implementing supply-side initiatives, you know, over the past 3 decades. You know, who could forget the 1992 program, the efficiencies that were going to come from the common currency, competition reforms, Lisbon agendas, other agendas. All worthy things, but actually, the following is a big, hard, nasty fact. The core EU 15 economies have grown at a slower pace in every decade since the 1960s. And that just comes back to something that, you know, what I went to graduate school at MIT, and I learned from the great Nobel Prize winner, Robert Solow. And Robert Solow won Nobel Prize partly for saying growth is very, very hard to predict and understand. And a lot of it comes from efficiency improvements that are not things that can be mandated by politicians. So from my perspective, well, given that we don't have any confidence, and we can't have too much confidence in what the effects of supply-side reforms are going to be, we can start from the big fact that Europe clearly has a large output gap. We have lots of unemployed people. Unemployment at 12% is at an all-time high for the Eurozone. So right now, Europe's problem is not a supply problem. It's not that we need to get supply up. That's a long-term issue. It's that demand is falling very far short of supply. So an alternative to supply-side reforms is for those countries that have room for fiscal maneuver to use it. Perhaps a series of coordinated fiscal stimulus programs in those countries that currently have very low borrowing rates. At present, what we're planning is the opposite. All of these countries that have room for fiscal maneuver are planning further consolidation. I think the clearest explanation, the clearest statement of of the policy approach that the euro area's surplus countries have came in Bundesbank President Jens Weidmann's speech last year. He had a speech called Rebalancing Europe. He said, yeah, Europe should rebalance, but the deficit countries should do all the rebalancing. Germany's doing just fine. There should be no fiscal stimulus in Germany. And instead, what we should all be doing, basically, Weidmann views Europe's route to success as being one where everybody cuts wages and costs, and we go out and compete with the US and China, and the euro area as a whole, we all run big surpluses. Now, again, as an economist, I view that as a sort of mercantilist approach. And you can go back and read in Adam Smith why we shouldn't view current account surpluses as a route to economic success. And the euro area broadly has never run big surpluses, and it's got something like a 1% of GDP surplus now, but it's pretty unlikely that that's going to be the route to success for Europe, partly because Europe has a strong currency and is going to continue to have a strong currency as long as the ECB continues to be the hard money, credible central bank that it's designed to be. So the rest of the world's trading blocs are also playing this game. They're playing it better than the euro area. So I just don't think that that's a vision of where the euro area is going to rebound from. Now, I know these kind of comments are not going to be well received in many quarters. And there's many people that believe there just isn't any room in the core euro area countries to raise spending or have a stimulus program. The facts are, borrowing rates for countries like Germany are extremely low. There have been times when financial markets have basically been willing to lend money to the German government for negative returns. So there is no sign of financial markets being concerned that Germany is going to default on its debt. And the euro area as a whole has a debt ratio very similar to the US and to other parts of the world where nobody's talking about defaults and so on. And also, importantly, where central banks are willing to purchase sovereign debt. Now, the ECB has been in the sovereign debt purchasing game. Right? The S&P was a program where they purchased bonds on the secondary market. There is nothing in terms of the legalities of this that would prevent the ECB acting as a sort of a monetary backup to a fiscal stimulus program, a coordinated fiscal stimulus program. So from my perspective, I think the shortfall of spending that we're seeing that is restraining growth, and I think also reforms in the euro area, is largely due to our own unwillingness to use policy options that are available. And that's a political problem. I mean, ultimately, I think that if the euro area is to succeed as a combined economic entity, we need to understand that we're not as weak as people think we are. Europe has lots of strengths, and if we believe in those strengths and act together in the common interest, I think the euro can be put on a path to success. But as of now, it's not on that path. With that, I'll sit down.
Thank you, Carol. And I think it's a speech that certainly will encourage people, or certainly ask them to examine themselves within their own comfort zone. And I would hope that maybe some of the questions that we will hear from the floor this morning may actually reflect that. If I can commence the question and answer session now, what I'm proposing is that I will take questionnaires in groups of 3. We'll propose that there will be 3 minutes for the interventions, questions, or statements or comments that members wish to make. So the first speaker I'll be calling upon is Mr. Arnold Meekes of the Netherlands House of Representatives. Mr. Meekes.
Thank you. Dear Chair, dear colleagues, a fortnight ago, the EU leaders agreed to a total EU budget of 960 billion for the next 7 years. Almost a dizzying €1 trillion. Unfortunately, the EU leaders forgot to agree on measures that ensure the public and transparent accountability of this enormous amount. Let me elaborate. The budget of the European Union is financed with public resources from the member states, and obviously the European taxpayers benefit from proper spending of their money. The lion's share of the EU budget, about 90%, is actually spent within the member states. And together with Mr. Lewandowski of the European Commission, the member states are co-responsible for the way the money is spent, managed and controlled. The European Court of Auditors, the institution that carries out the audits of the EU finances, has given a negative statement of assurance for 18 years in a row with regard to spending of EU funds. Another dizzying number. They have concluded year after year after year, still after 18 years, that the degree of compliance with the spending rules is much too low. And dear colleagues, it is on the level of the member states that these errors are made. The member states are accountable. Dear Chair, only 4 member states have a practice where national parliaments hold their government accountable for the way they spend European funds. Those 4 member states do so in a transparent manner. Not only in my country, but also in the UK, Sweden and Denmark, the governments take political responsibility for the way European tax money is spent in their respective countries. Every year, these countries issue a national declaration of assurance. Dear colleagues, the European citizens have the right to know how their tax money is spent. I therefore call upon you, as parliamentarians, to step up to your obligations and to improve the national accountability of the EU spending in your countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marquis. Our next speaker is Mr. Alain Lamassoure from the European Parliament. Mr. Lamassoure.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Le Parlement européen va avoir à se prononcer sur les conclusions du Conseil européen relatives au prochain cadre financier pluriannuel. Difficilement.
And the situation
Parce que la
looks
position prise par le
difficult.
Conseil européen
The position taken by the
pose un
European
problème
Council
politique,
raises
mais aussi un
a
problème
political,
institutionnel au
but
Parlement
also
européen.
an institutional
Un problème
problem for the
politique.
European Parliament. Now, the
Les
political
montants
problem
auxquels arrive
is
le
that
Conseil
the
européen
amounts agreed upon
aboutirait
by
à
the Council
réduire le budget
would
européen
mean
des 7 années à venir
reducing
par
the
rapport
budget over
au
the next
budget
7
actuel.
years compared to
Ça
the
ne
budget we
s'est
have
jamais
today. And
produit.
that has never been done before.
Ceci nous ramènerait en termes de crédit de paiement
In
en
terms of payment
2020
appropriations in
au niveau
2020,
par rapport au produit
we
intérieur brut où
would
était
be
l'Europe des 12
where
en
the
1987.
Europe of 12 was in
Compte tenu de ce qu'a indiqué le président, le
87
commissaire
in terms of
Lewandowski,
GDP. As Commissioner
compte tenu
Landowski
du
has
rôle
said,
que joue le budget européen,
given the
dont
role of the EU
94%
budget,
sont consacrés à l'intervention économique et au soutien de l'investissement.
14% of which is for economic
Et
support.
avec, par exemple, 10 pays européens dont 70%
And 10
des investissements publics sont financés par lui,
And 10
c'est une responsabilité
10
que le
countries
Parlement
financing
européen ne peut pas prendre.
70% of the public investments.
Parce qu'il
This is a
s'agit de
responsibility
cette année,
that the European
notre
Parliament cannot
mandat expire
take
l'année
on.
prochaine, nous ne pouvons pas
Our term of
politiquement
office is
condamner
about
nos
to end.
successeurs
We cannot
à un budget qui
condemn
baisserait
our
pendant 7 ans.
successors
Et
to
donc,
a
du point de
budget
vue
which will
budgétaire,
be
ce
in
que nous
increasing
exigeons
reduction over the
au
next
Parlement
7 years.
européen,
So, as
c'est
a budget authority
plus
in
de
the European Parliament,
flexibilité,
we
avoir plus
require
de
more
réactivité,
flexibility,
comme nous y invitent les crises des dernières années. Nous vivons dans un
more
monde
ability
imprévisible.
to react, such
Nous
as
avons
to the
besoin d'une
financial
clause de
crisis we've just
révision à
seen.
mi-parcours.
We need a
Si la
revision clause,
situation s'est améliorée
half-term
d'ici
revision clause. If the
2017-2018,
situation has improved by
revoyons l'ensemble du
2017-2018, then we should
et nous
review the
avons
whole
besoin
thing.
de commencer
And we need
à couper le
to
cordon ombilical
begin
entre
to
le
cut the
financement
umbilical
des budgets
cord
nationaux et le
between the
financement du budget
financing of
européen.
national
De la
budgets and
même
the
manière que
financing
tout
of
à
the
l'heure, dans
EU
la
budget.
première partie de la matinée, nous avons
This
réfléchi à la
morning,
manière
we
de
thought
séparer
about
les
how
dettes souveraines
to
des
separate
dettes des
sovereign
banques.
debt
Il
from
faut
the bank's debt.
recommencer à
In the
séparer
same way, we
ce
have
qui
to
était le cas
begin
depuis l'origine,
separating, as it
le
was
financement du
separated at
budget
the beginning,
européen,
the
le
financing
financement des
of the
budgets
EU
nationaux.
budget and the financing
Ça,
of the
c'est
national
le débat
budget.
budgétaire.
So that's
Nous
the
avons
budget
aussi un conflit
discussion we have. We
institutionnel
also have an institutional
entre le Conseil et le
conflict
Parlement, parce que le
between
traité de
the Council
Lisbonne
and the Parliament.
s'applique,
The Lisbon
parce
Treaty
que tous les critères de
applies
répartition des crédits
the
qui ont
distribution
été
of
adoptés adoptés par le
appropriations
Conseil européen et
which
qui
were adopted
aboutissent à satisfaire
by the Council,
l'ensemble des pays.
which
Ces
are
critères
meant to satisfy
relèvent
all of
du
the
pouvoir
countries,
législatif
are
et sur les règlements
part of the
législatifs, le
legislative
Parlement
power,
européen a tout pouvoir
and the
d'amendement et
European
va probablement
Parliament has
amender.
full power
C'est la
to
raison pour
amend
laquelle
this,
nous sommes
and probably
partis pour
will
une
amend
négociation
this.
qui serait longue.
So the
Nous
negotiations
vérifierons
are going to be
que les délais
lengthy.
nécessaires pour parvenir à un compromis que nous souhaitons
We
ne
will see to
compromettent
it
pas
that
le lancement des programmes et
programs that we
l'adoption
will
des
reach a
textes
compromise
législatifs.
in order
Merci.
to adopt the
Merci.
legislative text
Our
and
next
the
speaker
necessary
is
projects.
Mr. Andrzej Galwanowski from my Polish colleague next door to me can probably pronounce that.
Kołaszewski.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
It's
much.
difficult to
From the Polish Parliament.
say, but never mind. Everybody may read my name. Okay. Firstly, I would like to add one comment to my colleague from Netherlands. I think that its situation is different in different countries, of course. And I may say that the EU money is well managed in Poland, and spending is correct. And I think that Poland is a good example of success of cohesion policy. So it's you should compare different situations in different countries. So now, after long negotiations, the EU 2014-2020 budget is accepted by Council. It's not the budget of our dreams, but the Polish Parliament accepts achieved compromise. Now we carefully observe debates and negotiations in the European Parliament, and we expect that negotiations will be finalized in a reasonable time. There is no possibility to change a total sum of money for a 7 years period. So some procedural issues are now on the table. One of them is flexibility of the budget. The Polish Parliament accepts proposal of European Commission, and we think that it's a better proposal than division budget of multi-annual framework for parts, and starting from time to time with budget negotiations. I think it's a waste of time and of our nerves. Now, I may say the Polish citizens, entrepreneurs, self-governmental are waiting for final decision and do not understand these games which are played in Brussels. It's difficult to explain this. So, finally, we appeal, Polish Parliament appeal to European Parliament to be focused on common interest of all member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Günther Stimmwohl of the Austrian National Council.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, many thanks for the Irish presidency to organize this meeting. I'm sure that it will be an important step forward for a good cooperation between the national parliaments and the European Parliament, between national parliaments and the Commission, because I'm convinced that bringing Europe forward can only be done with the active involvement of European citizens and their representatives. And I'm sure that the future of the European Union depends on the political acceptance of European citizens. We must not lose them on our way in the future. For the financial framework, well, I think the agreement was an important signal of confidence in the future of the Union and removes uncertainties which exist. Well, it was a compromise, like all national budgetary negotiations. It was a compromise. But taking all in all, I'm convinced that this challenge, which was similar to squaring the circle, was managed successfully. Therefore, Mr. Lewandowski, you have my congratulations and my appreciation. But now we have the next challenge. This is the consent of the European Parliament. And we have colleagues from the European Parliament here, and my question goes to Mr. Lewandowski and to our colleagues from the European Parliament. How is your assessment of the forthcoming negotiations between the European Parliament and the Commission? And the second question is to Mr. Lewandowski. I always say, when you visited Austrian Parliament in October last year, I said the challenge is a triple one. It must be in line with EU strategy Europe 2020. It must be in line with the Stability and Growth Pact. It must be in line with the efforts of the member states to consolidate their budget, and so on and so on. But what, from your point of view, what's the main instrument to combat youth unemployment, which is in Europe, I think, has a top political priority? And the last question is, I think we have also the same opinion that the key, it's an important key for sustainable economic growth is competitiveness. Which are the main instruments from this financial framework to facilitate and to improve this competitiveness of Europe? Thank you very much.
Back to the panel, and we had issues there with regard to citizenship, competitiveness, the overall EU budget reduction, along with the issues of can it be revised, and is there a requirement for flexibility to be built into the cycle, and also the core member states with regard to the budgetary scrutiny and governance that they can actually apply to how Europe spends its money. So maybe if I could refer to yourself first, Commissioner Lewandowski.
Thank you for your comments, and starting with Mr. Merkes, he's right, yes, 80%, not 90, 80% of the expenditure is clearly the responsibility of the member states. Therefore, we have various standards around Europe, and I think, according to my estimates and knowledge, no longer the East-West division is existing in this respect as to the quality of spending. But actually, what is spent has a double check. National and European, and sometimes we are beyond the optimal point of controls over controls, because this is also costly. To impose too much of control upon spending. Therefore, what we hear from the Court of Auditors is, of course, that we have problems. Although this is not about the management by the Commission. Commission is regularly receiving clean assessment on clean books. That is about expenditure really via the different standards in different member states. But they are saying clearly, what is a problem of European budget is overregulation of formal rules. This is not equal to fraud. Fraud is 0.2% of the overall expenditure, what could be named and suspected as fraud. What is a major problem is irregularities due to these very formal rules, difficult especially for smaller beneficiaries. And they are saying us, without simplification, your error rate, not a fraud rate, but error rate will be huge, because even if we are not placing the flag of European Union or the table, that is already irregularity when the project is not equipped with that sort of table or flag, that is counted as irregularity already. So I think some simplification is necessary also to avoid the problems of especially small beneficiaries. But I take very positively your call for national certification. Yes, Netherlands is one of these models of national accountability. However, it comes much more difficult with federal states, because not always the I am not to name too many federal structures in Europe, but when you have the federal structure, not always the finance minister in the capital would like to be accountable for what is the responsibility of more autonomous regions. But generally, this is always a very strong voice of benevolence for accountability at the national level, and I like it really, because that is probably what we need in Europe. As for the position of European Parliament, I know it perfectly. President Lamassoure is making his voice heard on many occasions, and also he's right in saying that this is not the biggest budget. This is 1% of GNI. 4 to 5% of GNI of Europe was the cost of financial assistance to the banking and financial systems, 4 to 5% of GNI. And the European budget is around 1% and is declining as a share of public expenditure, because public expenditure is, despite the austerity measures, still in nominal terms in Europe growing, while the European budget in real terms for the future is to decline. So this is less than 2% of overall public expenditure, but it makes difference really as it comes to investment opportunities. And I was quoting figures really in many countries. In Hungary is the most extreme case. 97% of overall non-private investment is done via co-financing from Europe. But also there are many countries with 70 or more % of co-financing of investment. And so it makes difference as it comes for investment for growth and jobs. And I think the agenda also indicated by Mr. Gołaszewski, that is not only flexibility, but review clause. Review is not revision now, what is in conclusions. That is point 9 by 54. And this is like a Greek point with expectations of improvement of macroeconomic data. We should have review by 2016 in hope that we could add something. Not to reduce, but to add something. But this is not a typical revision European Parliament is asking for. And also own resources. We have very modest opening as for financial transaction tax. That is still a controversy among the member states. And the question of how to very complicated VAT system, this is really understood by very few experts around Europe, how it is working, how to change into more simple VAT contribution system is still open. Mr. Stumpfel, asking questions on my assessment of what should be the answer of our guests from the European Parliament, really. I do believe that with time, that is so much dependent upon the gaining real progress over flexibility. Without flexibility, it is difficult to manage budgets, because at the beginning, we are really not spending enough. There are delays, and we are behind the schedule. This is a very important message. Last time, the agreement between the governments was in December, and with the Parliament in April. So still more than half a year for preparations and launching of a new generations of programs. Now we are in February between the governments. There is hope for the Parliament under certain conditions for June. So probably delays 2014-15, not spent money. If we are not moving that small amounts as a carryovers, we are losing small amounts of money. And this is a really big challenging task for the Parliament not to lose. As for the market instruments for competitiveness, these are mainly in this competitiveness area. For research is not only grants for scientists, this is also about laboratories, technical equipment, so it makes difference also in terms of equipping Europe with some new capacities. But I really would like to test more what is called project bonds for infrastructure, to connect Europe better, not only in terms of transportation, but for energy security. And this is so clearly understood in Lithuania and Latvia, in Slovakia, to connect Europe. This is a precondition via cross-border interconnectors. This is a precondition of real energy security and diversification for Europe. So here are some instruments I can indicate in the European budget. Thank you for your very kind, as usual, voice.
Thank you, Commissioner. Professor Whelan?
I don't have a lot to say in terms of
Your mic, special mic.
I don't have a lot to say in relation to those questions. I don't want to minimize what are perfectly legitimate debates about the best usage of the EU budget. What I will say is that over the next number of years, with the EU budget fixed at 1% of GDP, it's not a vehicle that combats recession or offsets austerity. You know, there are many things it can do that may help with longer-term growth, which we don't know much about. You know, if we knew exactly what were the right policies to engineer growth, we'd be doing them. So I think these debates are fine, but given that the Eurozone economy is stuck in recession the last year and a half, I think we need to be a bit more focused on the crisis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Professor Whelan. Our next speaker is Mr. Georges Gilkenet of the Belgian Houses of Representatives. Mr. Gilkenet.
Thanks, Mr. President. I'd like especially to thank Mr. Whelan for his speech. It's a pity Mr. Wren wasn't present anymore to hear his analysis. Je pense que, comme je l'ai dit dans ma
première intervention,
as I said in the initial comments that I made, I think that fiscal austerity has its limits, given the social consequences, internal consumption in states, the economic consequences, loss of confidence in our system, and over and above that, as Mr. Lewandowski has just explained, you have a fiscal decision which really causes problems. States looking in upon themselves, where you need more Europe to respond to the challenges. This disappointing budget with very little investment in the future is disappointing, and I must say I support the European parliamentarians when they resist the Council decision when it comes to the budget. Now, I'd like to look at three aspects, three ways of improving the situation. The first one Mr. Lewandowski mentioned, it's budget appropriations as they've been decided. Could the Commission look at the future as a priority? So research, education, energy, and perhaps move away from other sectors such as what we think, for example, are excessive subsidies to industry, and come back to a more local economy. Then, second, in order to be able to increase the envelope, and I think what's involved in European construction is also the own resources of the Union, in Belgium, we believe that a financial transaction tax, well, there's no consensus within Europe on this, but first, it would make it possible to increase own resources and thus improve the construction of Europe, but also transfer the burden, which at present is on employment costs, and shift that to the income of the financial sector, the revenues in the financial sector, because as you say, this link between the banks and governments. Then, the capacity to invest, it's the way in which the bankers play their role in supporting the real economy. This is the third aspect. You were talking about project bonds. Shouldn't we actually develop that idea, strengthen it, but perhaps consider not so much the energy shift, the energy switch, but on saving energy. So we want energy effectiveness, efficiency, but also focusing on small and medium-sized enterprises in our company. I think we should oblige the banking sector to reconsider their role in terms of the real economy, and I think that's a way of creating jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Gillard. Our next speaker is Mr. Roger Negri of the Luxembourg Chamber of Deputies. Mr. Negri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Don't you think that the budget over 7 years in these times of crisis is not too long, too far away? Let's think back 7 years ago. It was in February 2006. Who would can see at this time what will happen in 2007, 2008 with the results of now perhaps youth unemployment more than 50% of some of our countries. I think that you must propose a medium validation, otherwise it will not perhaps responsible to give in a certain way a blank check. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Negri. Our next speaker is Mr. Antonius Isas of the Greek Hellenic Parliament.
Thank you, Mr. President. The recent agreement upon the new MFF has been a necessary step for EU's further small faction, taking into consideration the economic period it is currently undergoing. The prolongation of uncertainty would lead to delays in programming new actions, while sending a negative message to markets and the international public opinion regarding EU's capability to decide in a timely and effective manner on crucial issues concerning its future. Nevertheless, even if it is welcomed, the agreement reached does not adequately respond to the EU's needs, especially under the present financial circumstances of recession and unemployment. Given that the EU budget constitutes the most powerful means of financing investments in Europe, the proposed reductions will negatively affect the lives of our citizens. Given negotiation difficulties, together with the initial pessimistic assessments, our country's gains are deemed satisfactory. Substantial funds are those of cohesion policy and for rural development. An important possibility is also offered for the support of immigration programs, since Greece is shouldering major costs as an immigrant receiving country in the EU. Concerning the resources, the creation of a mixture of own resources, such as the financial transaction tax and the new VAT, constitutes a basic challenge for the EU. It is obvious that the implementation of this new system will lead to the significant reduction of national budgets. Finally, we believe that the revision clause is a positive measure, as it may bring about additional necessary resources after 2016 for supporting policies for economic development and for combating unemployment in countries where recession dimensions have not yet been fully depicted by the available statistical data. Because of the fact the European Parliament is the main institution expressing democratic legitimacy of EU's decisions, its skepticism about the agreement on the MFF should be dealt with in the framework of a benevolent negotiation with the European Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bazaz. Those three questionnaires just revolved around three issues. We had a very obvious position that where we started in 2006 was not where we ended up in 2013, in quite entirely different place. The issue of the constraints of the current fiscal policies and the economic policies that are being pursued, and how rigid that they actually are in some suggested approaches, and also some ideas with regard to combating difficulties that countries are facing at the moment and putting in place within the budget, and the impact upon the member states with regard to how the budget has actually been reduced. So, Commissioner.
Again, thank you. Following the pronunciations of Mr. I would stick to the Anglo-Saxon pronunciation of your name. Gilkinet should be like that in Anglo-Saxon pronunciation. I know that this is probably different from the French pronunciation or the Belgian pronunciation. But your point was partly a question to Mr. Whelan, again discussing this optimal economic mix for Europe. What is the optimal economic mix for Europe nowadays, with lessons also of political dimension on perhaps in 2009 and 10 too much one-sided austerity and not coupled with some measures to produce growth and jobs. Here is the difficulty of Europe, because I understand that in majority of national budgets, due also to the excessive deficit procedure, there is no room for maneuver for the real fiscal stimulus. I think the only country to announce the fiscal stimulus out of their own national budget is Sweden so far, given also some possibilities of a country with more balanced finances. Therefore, the small European budget could be partially the answer, but not the perfect answer, because this is small. It makes difference in terms of investment, but this is really small in terms of volume. So here is the point really for Mr. Whelan. But as for the opening towards own resources, you know, the position of not only House of Lords, but UK was very tough on the rebate. Therefore, we are rather conservative on this side, although the position of the European Parliament was for real opening. We have only enhanced cooperation of 11 states on financial transaction tax, which is a sort of taxation, I think, least detrimental to real economy. This is also, to some extent, popular with people. There is a populist, a little bit of punishing bankers, but this is least detrimental to real economy type of new own resources. But this is a small opening. So we remain with British rebate, and we remained with a long queue of net payers with their own privileges, like reduced call rate, that is for Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, and some rebates for Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, and also Austria, extending the line of countries, because everybody is observing the position of a neighbor. Therefore, this propensity to extend the list of privileges on revenue side is really long. That is the fact of life. That was the state of affairs at the level of difficult negotiations between the governments. It has to be about unanimity. I think unanimity was precondition for predictability, and not the experiments with annual budgets or something like that, because this is a value of a European budget, to give some predictability for multi-annual projects. Also, in terms of project bonds, our contribution from the budget should be rather modest. It should be 50 billion in our original proposal, but now cut to 30 billion. What remained not so much cut was transportation. That is our assessment, also the member states showing assessment, that the most difficult part of long-term infrastructure projects is in transportation. You can find more easily, but still very difficult, money for energy networks. And the most promising to mobilize private capital is telecommunication. Therefore, what was cut mostly was telecommunication. Second was energy. And what was left was mainly about long-term projects in transportation. So this is our testing ground for the future, to what extent we can mobilize private capital in area of transportation and energy networks via increasing the rating of the projects via contribution and risk sharing from the European budget. As for Mr. Negri, I can only agree that really, given this long-term prospect until 2020, we don't know what would be Europe like, and by 2020, therefore, some flexibility also in adjusting budgets is necessary. Mr. Bezos from Greece was expressing also my feeling that probably financing 27 plus Croatia, which should be a part of our vision for future, starting this year, because we have provisions, budgetary provisions for Croatia for 2013. That could be not enough given the challenges of Europe. But here is again a reality of today's austerity in Europe, that we have only some provisions for crisis-affected countries, probably not up to the expectations of Greece. However, Samaras, your Prime Minister, and formerly my colleague from the European Parliament, from the Budgetary Committee, was, I have to say, very successful in the final night. Gifts negotiations, because last minute this is about country-specific, origin-specific